Welcome to the Wise Owl Knits podcast. I'm your host, Cheryl Beckridge, and I thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch. Make sure you watch to the end so you can see who won the Tuck Stitches book from Nancy Marchant. Today I am wearing my cable top boxy, and this is one of my patterns that's probably 5 or 6 years old, but it's a sweater that I really love. It features this cable on each shoulder, and this sweater starts at the turtleneck, so you work just a tube of ribbing for the turtleneck, and then you pick up stitches on each side to make this band that comes out on each shoulder and arm. So you've got a turtleneck and then 2 bands. And then you pick up stitches for the front and you pick up stitches for the back. So you work the front and the back separately until under the armholes, and then it's joined to work in the round. So this sweater is made out of DK weight yarn. This is some yarn that I got on vacation when I was in Maine. We were in Camden, Maine, and we went into the store, Swan Island, and they sell some yarn, but they mostly sell items that are already made. A lot of beautiful and expensive blankets and just all kinds of really cool New England-y things for the home. So I got this yarn there, so vacation yarn, and the sweater is what came from it. You could use any DK weight yarn as long as you can get gauge, or probably even a light worsted weight would work for this sweater too. And if you wanted to use something else, you can always use the gauge switch tool that's available on my website. That gauge switch tool, incidentally, is the same as Knitty McPurley's gauge stitch switcheroo, but the version on my website does all the math for you. So if you'd like to use a little bit of automation, the gauge switch tool is listed under tools on my website. Okay, well, I finished a couple of things this week, and one of which is the Black Canyon of Gunnison hat that is in the Nancy Bates book, Knitting the National Parks. And this started out actually with a different yarn. I had run out of yarn when I was in Colorado, and the only thing that I could find was some acrylic yarn from Michaels, and I started knitting the hat, and I got about halfway through it before I was like, I know I shouldn't use acrylic yarn on stranded color work, and I just decided to tear it out and use some stash yarn. So the gray is some Knit Picks Swish DK, and the peachy pink is from Mystery Mouse Yarns. That's some yarn that I got originally for my latest cowboy sweater, but I ended up not using it. But it worked out perfectly for this hat. So the Black Canyon of Gunnison hat, I did do some ladder back jacquard on the inside because this had some super long floats. It was kind of a, see all my ends here, don't have any of my ends tucked in. It was a pattern that you really had to pay attention on because there weren't any symmetrical repeating patterns. Every line was different, and sometimes there were 20 gray stitches in a row, and then the next row there might be 22, and then the next row there might be 18. So there was a lot of counting of the little squares, and I used the chart, and then just making a little note on the chart how many stitches that I had to do. The chart was for 1/2 of the hat, so every round you knit that chart twice. So at the beginning I was counting on the front half and then counting again on the second half, and I thought, well, this is kind of for the birds. I should just make a note of how many stitches are here in the gray and not have to count over and over again. So my first National Park hat, I'm sure I will be doing more. I'm not sure which one I'm going to do next, but I think it's going to be Great Sand Dunes. So Knitting the National Parks from Nancy Bates. The other thing that I finished is my second Libby shawl. So this is my green version, which is, yeah, I want to make sure I had the right side facing, which is knit out of Tuscan Knits fingering weight yarn that is a combination of wool and mohair. So the Libby shawl will be ready to be debuted next week, but before that time, if you want to get in on a pre-release discount, I'm going to use the code 64Libby for a 20% discount if you purchase that now, and then once the pattern comes out, I will send you the completed pattern. I know you've seen the blue version before, but this is that too. The blue yarn is from Aweneth Yarn and Fiber, and it's a merino superwash, and the color I'm doing a Resistance. So those are the two things that I've finished. I haven't started anything, well, I have only started a swatch for a new design, and I'll tell you the little story about that. I was sitting in church looking at people's clothes, as I often do, which I shouldn't be doing, but I was doing that, and I saw a young college-age girl, and she was wearing a really cute cabled vest. So after Mass, I went over to talk to her, and I asked her if her mom made the vest, because her mom does knit, and her mom walked up right then, and she's like, "No, I didn't make it. I bought it at Target. It was $6 on clearance, and Libby just stole it out of my closet." Yeah, so the shawl is named Libby. The young woman was also named Libby. So I thought, you know, that's a really cute vest. It looked so cute on her. It was a little bit oversized, and kind of in a traditional Aran pattern where it had a big panel in the front of one cable with other cables, smaller cables flanking it on each side. So I started doing some swatching for that, and I think the center cable will be a little bit bigger than this, like one repeat more, but I believe this is going to be the center cable, the focus cable, and then I'll do some kind of a braid cable on each side. So this yarn is some Cascade 220 Sport, and I had made another sweater out of this before, this minty green. So I've got some other yarn coming that is still Cascade 220 Sport, but a more neutral color. So that is on the way, and I may probably will do a baby blanket in this same pattern because I'm gonna be a grandma. So the baby knitting will be coming. Just be prepared for that. You'll see lots of baby knitting in my future. So that is really the only thing that I'm working on right now. And you'll see more of this stuff later. That yarn should be here this week, so you'll probably see either the blanket or the vest popping up a lot. I may do the blanket first just to get really in tune with that cable pattern, but we'll see. I'll probably dive into both. You know how that goes. I also wanted to mention that along with paid patterns, there are quite a few free patterns on my website. One really popular pattern is the Hat Squared. This can be knit in any weight, for any size. It's kind of more of a formula than an actual pattern. I'm going to take this pom-pom off real quick so I can show you that this is a tubular hat, much like that popular pattern that many people knit. So the Hat Squared is a long tube, increases at the beginning, decreases at the end, and ribbing in the middle. So, and you can make it, this particular version is DK, but you can make it in fingering, you can make it in bulky, you can make it really in whatever you want. And you can make it all one color. You don't have to switch colors. You can also make the ribbing longer in the center if you want to fold it up. But just a really flexible, fun pattern, and it's free on my website. So head over and grab that. Delving into knitting history once again, today I'm going to talk about Fair Isle. And Fair Isle knitting is, of course, stranded colorwork knitting, and it has a couple of specific features that make it different from other stranded colorwork. First of all, you never use more than 2 colors at a time, and that makes for happier knitters, because when you get to those points where you have to use more than 2 colors in a colorwork pattern, everybody starts to cringe. So you never use more than 2 colors at a time. You go from pattern to pattern with no rows in between without color work. So there always is some kind of color work going on. The early Fair Isle patterns used maybe 3 to 5 colors, and then as dyes started getting better, there were more commercial dyes rather than just plant dyes or chemical dyes. More colors were available, but originally there were yellows, browns, reds from cochineal, blues from indigo, and those were basically the color palettes, though the actual colors, the actual patterns could vary so much because of the different designs and the different placements of the colors. So where did Fair Isle begin? On a small island off the coast of Scotland, part of the Shetland Islands, the very southernmost and smallest island is called Fair Isle. And there are some theories about how Fair Isle came to this little island, but I think they're all just, they seem to be all kind of made up tales. The first really instance documented Fair Isle knitting happened in the 1840s, but it didn't become really popular until quite a bit later. So on the Isle of Fair Isle, there was mostly a farming and fishing economy, and fishing outweighed farming. There were sheep on the island, and so shepherds, they grew some crops, and they tended to trade with fishermen that were from other areas that just stopped at the island. So there was a theory that there was a Spanish ship that was out fishing that crashed into Fair Isle, or just off the coast of Fair Isle, and it was at the beginning of winter, and so all the people that were on the boat came to the island, and the island people took care of them. These people were from Spain. They repaid the kindness of the people from Fair Isle by teaching them these different stitch patterns and knitting. Okay, well, the counter to that theory was there's not much space on Fair Isle, and there are not very many people on Fair Isle because this small piece of land can only support a certain number of people. So when this ship crashed, they didn't try to rescue these people. They tried to get them away. They let them starve. They threw them off cliffs. They just wanted them gone because their arrival was threatening the existence of the people that lived on the island. So I don't know, probably a combination of the two. But going beyond that, there were many ships from different places that fished off the coast of Fair Isle, and there probably was influence from not only Spanish people that came and traded, but Nordic people that came and traded. And if you look at the Fair Isle stitch patterns, there are some of both, some more Moorish designs and then some more Scandinavian designs. So likely the patterns just developed because they did have visitors from different places that came to that area to fish. So at some point around 1840, the women of the island started knitting these patterns into sweaters, and they weren't able to sell the sweaters to the merchants on the island, but they were able to trade with them for food using something called the truck system, which they would knit a sweater, they'd take it to the market, they'd say, I need flour and sugar and eggs, and they probably didn't do eggs because they probably had their own chickens, but they traded for the things that they needed. But they did not, the knitters did not get to determine the value of the sweater, the merchants did. So it, they were probably getting a raw deal, not getting as much for these sweaters as they should have. Now, as time went on, people in other parts of Shetland started knitting these sweaters too, but they still hadn't really become popular until around 1920. There was a yarn merchant in mainland Shetland, or one of the other islands of Shetland, that sent one of these Fair Isle sweaters to the Prince of Wales. And the Prince of Wales liked it, and he got his portrait painted wearing this Fair Isle sweater. So I'll insert that picture here for you. And when that happened and that portrait was finished, that particular sweater just became wildly popular. And so the ladies of Fair Isle and of Shetland were then able to sell their finished sweaters to people in England for actual cash money rather than trading with the merchants. So that really helped the women of the island start making a little more money for their labor of knitting. And like many other places, the Aran Islands comes to mind with the people knitting cable sweaters. These women were knitting all the time while they were doing other things, and they often had those knitting belts, which you could stick one needle, I think your left needle into the knitting belt and hold that needle fixed and then knit from there. And I'm not sure how, but supposedly that was a faster way of knitting so that they could be a little bit more productive. So once the Prince of Wales got that sweater and wore it for his portrait, the market just opened up to them. And then that sweater became popular not only in England, and I think it started really at Oxford, like the college boys at Oxford wanted these sweaters. And then it just spread and spread, and they became popular really all over the world. Now they've gone in and out of popularity, as any knitted item does, but it is a style of knitting that is definitely here to stay. So that is just a brief overview history of Fair Isle knitting. It's interesting though that all the knitting styles that I've looked at so far, which are cables, brioche, and Fair Isle, they all began around the same time, which is the mid to late 1800s. And so there probably was some of all of them happening before that time, but that was the earliest instances that can be documented. There is a textile museum in Washington, D.C., and I would really love to go to it because a lot of these things are documented there. But I'm sure I can look at a lot of that on the internet, so I probably will look into that soon. So I'm just going to insert this timeline, knitting timeline, to show you that Fair Isle, 1840, brioche, 1850, and cables, 1880 or 1890. So as we talk about different techniques, I'll add those to the timeline. Do you ever lose your knitting items? I lose mine quite a bit, and usually in funny ways. And I'm going to just tell you a quick story about knitting out on my deck. We have a nice big deck. There's different levels, and it's just a great place to be, weather permitting. But, you know, as any deck is, it has these little small lines of space between the boards. And if I drop something, you know, the little line is so much smaller than the big board, but if you're going to drop something like a stitch marker or a tapestry needle, it is going to go through that hole. So we have an area of our deck where there's a bar and there's a TV, and I would sit there at the bar a lot of times and knit, and inevitably I would drop something and it would go through the hole. So I ended up getting a rug to go under that area, one of those outdoor rugs, so that, you know, when I drop things, I'd be able to look down on the rug and pick it up. So got that there. And then we've got another area where it's a sitting area where there's a cover and there is a love seat and 2 chairs and a coffee table out there. So I was knitting out there with my Knit Night ladies, and I had just gotten a set of Flexi Flip needles, and this was back when they first came out. They were fairly pricey for needles, and I really wanted to try them. And of course, what happened? I dropped one and it went right through the crack. Didn't have a rug right there. And the way our deck is made, there are boards on the outside that make it so you can't get underneath it very easily. So I was like, what am I gonna do? I just like dropped one of these, I don't remember how much they cost, but $17 sticks in my head. So I just, maybe it was 27. That may be more likely because they were more than what I normally spent on needles, and especially like a set of double points. So I was just kind of mad at myself for doing it, and I asked my husband about it, and he came out and he's like, well, I can take a deck board off, or I can take one of the sideboards off and maybe get it. And he's got a tool that has a magnet on the end. So he took things apart and finally ended up rescuing that needle. And at that time I was just like, I dropped my needle. I didn't tell him how much they cost because I thought he would think that was crazy, and it might have been crazy. So do you have any stories like that where you've lost your knitting supplies in a funny way, like yarn rolling through the underneath of all the chairs in an airplane, or dropping something when you're knitting on the back of a motorcycle? If you've got any of those stories, leave those for me in the comments. We can all get a good giggle out of them. Had lots of good comments last week, most of which were about winning the Tuck Stitches book, and several about brioche, whether it be about brioche being hard, like Emily from Woolenburn said, she tried brioche a couple of years ago, and she didn't know until after she tried it that it was supposed to be hard. But since she didn't know, she just dove in and did it. And then a couple other people that said they'd really like to try it, but they were just a little apprehensive because it is so hard. And it really is not hard to do. It is harder to read your knitting, and it's harder to fix mistakes. So as long as you go slow and are careful, you probably won't have any problems at all. And you will make mistakes, and you will eventually learn how to fix them. I'm still not perfect at fixing them, but I'm beginning to feel a little more confident. So the winner of the book is Sharon Cody Cowgirl Creates. So Sharon, you get the book. Just send me a message. I think you have my email, but you can either send me an Instagram message with your address, or you can go on my website and use the Contact Me page to send me an email. So Sharon Cody Cowgirl Creates, congratulations. Thank you so much for watching today. I really appreciate you being here. Please, if you haven't already subscribed, subscribe now. Hit the like button if you like what you see and the notification bell, and leave me a comment.